Thank you very much to the Norwegian Atlantic Committee for inviting me. I'm going to be very disciplined and use my time to give you an overview of the Europe-China relationship in the current environment, which everyone has characterized so far as intensifying great power competition. Many Chinese IR scholars like to talk about big trends in international relations or prevailing structural trends. I would argue that the current prevailing structural trend in the European policy towards China is one of overall convergence with the US-China policy. Convergence doesn't mean full alignment, and there are elements of divergence in the European approach. But overall, and I will give you a few examples, especially in the area of controlling tech transfers, I see quite a lot of convergence at the transatlantic level. This is also a convergence in terms of the prevailing narrative that Europe and the US have with regards to engagement with China and the final goal of engagement. As everyone, I think, in this room knows, the previous prevailing narrative was that engagement would lead to convergence in terms of political systems and governance models. I think now in Europe, like in the US, there has been the conclusion that engagement with China will not change the fact that we are dealing with an increasingly authoritarian state. And this is also the conclusion that has been taken in Brussels. I think there's also convergence in terms of how we assess the fact that there is a competition between governance models, there is a competition between political values, and there is a lack of reciprocity in the trade and investment relationship that needs to be corrected with policy measures. And the second prevailing trend that I see in the European policy towards China is one of securitization, securitizing the trade and investment relationship. You know that the trade and investment relationship is clearly the driver of the EU-China relationship. There's 1.7 billion US dollars of trade per day, which is a huge amount and a major trade deficit for Europe. And this is a security conference. So looking at it from a security perspective, I think that the policy discussion and the policy measures in Europe are evolving towards securitizing this trade and investment relationship. So if you sum this up in terms of the key question for the future of European policy towards China and the future of Europe in this environment of US-China intensifying competition, I think the question is whether the current approach of the European Union and Europe in general of trying to find some sort of a middle ground is going to be a sustainable posture in the longer term. Now, if you move this discussion to the state of Europe-China relations and what we say about each other, I think it's clear that there is a mismatch in the narratives in Europe vis-à-vis China and in China vis-à-vis Europe. If you look at the last major policy guidelines of the EU Strategic Outlook that was issued last year in March, one of the key sentences is that the balance between challenges and opportunities presented by China has shifted. That China is, everyone remembers the term, I think, a systemic rival, promoting alternative models of governance, but not only a systemic rival, also in several policy areas, a cooperation partner, a negotiating partner, and an economic competitor. So it's not only a systemic rival, it's more than that. But if you look at this paper, I think it's interesting to see, when you compare it to previous European policy documents, that the policy objectives have shrunk to only 3 priorities that are still to deepen engagement with China on issues where there are common interests at the global level, but also to reach more balanced relations and more reciprocal conditions for the conduct of the economic relationship between the EU and China. And third, and this is not about relations with China, this is about Europe, domestic adaptation in Europe to maintain European prosperity values and the social model. So if you sum up in terms of the aims of the European Union when it comes to China, I would say 2 aims. Number 1, reaching some sort of a rebalance. And number 2, building a defensive net to still engage with China, but with a efficient toolbox. Now, when you look at what the Chinese say regarding the relationship with Europe, there was a very recent speech by Wang Yi when he came to Brussels, the foreign minister, when he talked of a new historical starting point, when he repeated that China's support for European unity was, I quote, a strategic choice, that there were no geopolitical contradictions and no conflicts of interest between China and Europe. But I would contrast this statement with an interview that was given by the Chinese ambassador to the EU, Zhang Ming, to the Financial Times, when he in fact listed a series of problems that China sees in the conduct of its relationship with Europe. Number one being how the investment environment in Europe is being rebuilt in a sense that is stricter towards Chinese investors. Number two, with regards to Huawei and the 5G discussion that is taking place in Europe right now. Number three, what he calls Europe's unjust and dishonest rhetoric when it comes to human rights and influence operations on democratic systems. So when you contrast the two, I mean, on the one hand, you have a very optimistic outlook on the future of Europe-China relations. On the second hand, at a more practical level, you have a list of problems that China sees in the current Europe-China relationship. So if I had to sum up, I would say that China's aims are some sort of preserving the status quo when it comes to the trade and investment relationship. And I would use the word neutralization, neutralize some of the defensive measures that Europe is currently taking. So rebalance and defensive on the one hand, status quo and neutralization on the other hand. That's a mismatch. And 2020 is going to be a key year to observe how this mismatch will play out, because some key decisions will be taken in several very important policy areas for Europe-China relations. Number one, 5G. Many countries are deciding. Number two, the EU-China summit that the German presidency of the European Union will host in Leipzig in September, and for which Germany and I think the EU Commission hope that the bilateral investment agreement that is currently being negotiated with China will come to a conclusion. And number three, the implementation of the newly established investment screening mechanism by the European Union by October 2020. So on three very important areas for the two sides, in investment and in telecommunications, this will be the year of decisions. And if you allow me to go a little bit deeper in this issue of the European defensive toolbox, I would characterize it as a moving process, but also an unfinished business. So if you take, for example, the investment screening mechanism that the European Union is putting in place currently at the moment, building a communication system among the 27 EU member states to share information regarding incoming foreign investments and their potential impact on technology transfers, potential impact on the integrity of critical infrastructure in Europe, because this is mainly about these two things, critical infrastructure and technology transfers. So this is currently being built, but no one should expect a US-type CFIUS sort of mechanism, because this is not going to be endowing the Commission with executive power to impose remedies or block investment or impose penalties on states. This is more a process of exchanging information, influencing each other. Member states will influence other member states. The Commission will be able to start an investigation. So by the moment in October 2020, when the investment screening mechanism will be in place, an incoming, let's say, Chinese investments in a port in Europe will be treated differently from the way some investments where China got majority stakes, like Piraeus or Zeebrugge, were treated in the past. Certainly, there will be a different dynamic in Europe once the system is in place. But at the same time, the EU is working in always the same modus operandi. It's about building best practices and building convergence. So as of today, 15 EU member states have an investment screening system in place, which means that 12 do not have an investment screening in place. So we will have a very still diverse Europe. So more convergence, but still diversity. Now, when you look at the security of 5G infrastructure, the EU toolbox of defensive measures to deal with what is called high-risk vendors has been issued last week, finally, after 1 month of delay. It's a very interesting document in the sense that it defines high-risk vendors not only in technical terms, but also in political terms. It's not only about the integrity of telecommunication networks, it's also about the risk of interference, the legislative and legal framework in the country of origin of the supplier of telecommunication equipment. It's really, without naming Huawei, it's really basically taking Huawei as a potential threat to the integrity of the European telecommunications sector. That's really in the background. Each line is about how to manage the risks that we will face when Huawei will be part of the European 5G infrastructure. So if you think in terms of what will be the situation in 5 years, it will be very similar to what is the situation today with 4G telecommunications network. There will be a number of suppliers, including Huawei. There will be technical measures to monitor and manage the risks linked to telecommunications, but this will be an unfinished business as well, and a fragmented European continent when it comes to which equipment provider is running which networks. Now let me move briefly to what is the third European priority, the engagement on the international front. I think, like in the United States, there is a lot of frustration in Europe when it comes to international cooperation with China on security hotspots worldwide. I want to be very brief on this, but I think that the policy of engaging China as an international security partner used to be a signature of the European Union. It was basically, let's engage about everything, and China is a potential solution to a lot of problems. It just takes China to really put its weight into the problem, and this will be a game changer. This was basically the thinking maybe 10 years ago. I think it completely changed by now, and it changed as a result of actual facts on the ground. There are disagreements regarding Syria. There are disagreements regarding the South China Sea. There is a lot of disappointment when it comes to Afghanistan, I would say, because China is indeed more engaged, but not as a key partner. You can name this international crisis where it's actually not happening. And in the area where there was actual cooperation, and there is still actual military engagement in the Gulf of Aden, where there are joint exercises being conducted with the Chinese Navy, very modest in terms of scope and scale of the exercises. Now I think that the reflection in Europe has also changed and focuses more on the potential use of the Djibouti naval base for different sorts of operation beyond the three that China has listed as the three actually very convincing reasons why it has decided to build a base in Djibouti. And if you take the areas where Europe and China converge, GCPOA is one example. The least I can say is that this convergence has not been consequential. There has been no impact on the ground of the Europe-China convergence on the GCPOA, and the logic has now completely moved with the European decision to activate the dispute resolution mechanism. But looking at last year, it could have been different. At least there was some hope by some that this would be consequential. And if you look at the other area where there is a very strong convergent narrative between Europe and China, which is the defense of the multilateral system, the defense of multilateralism, you don't see a lot of examples where this convergence actually produces results. And I have a list of examples of actual divergence in some multilateral organization, the Chemical Weapons Convention, or the issue of the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And on purpose, I choose one example in the area of arms control and one example in the area of environment. So what do we make of that? I think looking back at what China can realistically achieve in its relationship with Europe in the current environment, I would say that China's best realistic outcome is to get a fragmented Europe because tech transfers is so important, and because 5G is so important, and because having a united European position, if it moves in the direction of convergence with the United States, is going to be not to be in the interest of China. And where are we going from a European perspective? I think that by 2025, and I will end on that, let's imagine a scenario by which Huawei has 25–30% of European telecommunications infrastructure, and there is a major crisis in US-China relations. What will be the impact on reaching a unified European position in support of the United States? I think this is really an area where the question of leverage and influence is extremely strategic, and I don't see that the policy discussion is going in that direction at the moment. So I will leave you with that. Thank you very much.